The Supreme Court has upended American trade policy, sending shockwaves through the nation's economic and political landscape. In a landmark decision, the court has overturned the Trump-era tariffs and directly challenged the president's sweeping authority over international commerce, a power that has shaped U.S. trade for decades. On August 4, 2025, the court struck down tariffs imposed under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, a Cold War law originally designed to protect national security interests during a tense era of global politics. The Trump administration had used this law to levy tariffs on steel and aluminum, arguing that these imports posed a threat to U.S. security and the nation's industrial base. But the court ruled that this delegation of power to the executive branch was too broad, reining in presidential authority and restoring a crucial measure of congressional oversight over trade decisions. For American consumers, this could mean lower prices on everyday goods like appliances and cars, as tariffs that once raised costs are now eliminated, potentially making these products more affordable for families across the country. U.S. manufacturers who rely on imported steel and aluminum may see significant relief, with reduced input costs helping them compete more effectively, both at home and abroad. However, domestic producers who benefited from these protective tariffs may now face increased competition, losing the shield that once helped them maintain market share. The decision resets the entire trade landscape, forcing businesses to adapt quickly and compelling Congress to reconsider its role and responsibilities in shaping U.S. trade policy for the future. Retaliatory tariffs from other countries may also be lifted, easing international tensions and opening new opportunities for American exporters to access global markets. This historic ruling marks a turning point, shifting the balance of power in Washington and sparking a new debate over how America manages its complex global economic relationships in an increasingly interconnected world. The era of unilateral trade action by the executive is over. From now on, the future of U.S. trade will be shaped by Congress, international negotiation, and a renewed focus on collaboration and transparency. Section 232 was designed to let the president restrict imports that threaten national security, originally focused on critical defense materials. The Trump administration expanded this to cover broad economic concerns, imposing tariffs on allies and adversaries alike. Critics argued this was economic protectionism disguised as security, straining alliances and inviting legal challenges. The broad use of Section 232 blurred the line between economic policy and national defense, raising constitutional questions. The Supreme Court's decision now narrows this authority, demanding a clearer link between trade actions and genuine security threats. The tariffs initially gave a short-term boost to U.S. steel and aluminum producers, allowing these industries to ramp up production and temporarily increase profits. For a brief period, some workers in these sectors saw job security improve, and a handful of plants even reopened, fueling optimism in certain communities. But this came at a steep cost to the broader economy, as the benefits were not evenly distributed and many other sectors began to feel the strain. American manufacturers, who rely on steel and aluminum as key inputs, faced higher material costs. This made their products less competitive both at home and abroad, forcing many companies to raise prices for consumers and cut back on production. Multiple studies showed that the tariffs ultimately cost far more in lost jobs and higher prices than they created in the protected industries, with ripple effects across the entire supply chain. Retaliatory tariffs from the EU, China, and other trading partners targeted iconic American exports like soybeans, whiskey, and motorcycles, escalating the trade war and inflicting real pain on U.S. farmers and manufacturers who suddenly lost access to key markets. The policy's net effect was negative: higher consumer prices, disrupted supply chains, and a measurable reduction in U.S. GDP growth, as uncertainty rippled through the economy. Uncertainty over trade rules discouraged investment and hiring, chilling economic growth and making it harder for businesses to plan for the future. The tariffs' benefits were concentrated in a few industries, but the pain was widespread, affecting millions of American workers, families, and small businesses across the country. The Supreme Court's recent ruling ends this cycle of escalating tariffs, but the economic scars and lost opportunities remain, serving as a stark reminder of the policy's consequences. American businesses must now adjust to a new, more open trade environment, rethinking their strategies and rebuilding relationships with global partners. The hope is for lower prices, renewed export opportunities, and a more stable economic outlook, but the transition will be complex and require careful navigation. The lesson is clear: protectionism can backfire, harming more than it helps and leaving lasting damage that takes years to repair. The U.S. must now work to rebuild trust with trading partners, restore stability to global commerce, and ensure that future policies support both American workers and the broader economy. Steel importers and trade groups brought their case before the Supreme Court, arguing that Section 232 granted the president virtually unchecked power over trade policy, which they believed violated the Constitution's separation of powers. They warned that such broad authority could undermine the careful balance between the branches of government. The challengers claimed the law lacked clear, objective standards, effectively allowing the executive branch to impose tariffs for almost any reason, simply by invoking national security. This, they argued, opened the door to potential abuse and arbitrary decision-making. In response, the government's lawyers countered that national security concerns often require broad presidential discretion, especially when dealing with complex and rapidly changing foreign affairs. They emphasized the need for flexibility in protecting the nation's interests. The government cited a long history of Congress delegating trade authority to the executive branch, pointing to legal precedents and past practices. They warned that judicial interference could disrupt the delicate balance of power in matters of national policy. The plaintiffs, however, insisted that imposing tariffs on close U.S. allies demonstrated the law's misuse. They argued that only Congress, as the legislative branch, should have the power to set such sweeping and impactful trade policies. The government maintained that the president acted strictly within the statutory authority provided by Congress, following a thorough Commerce Department investigation and official recommendations. At the heart of the case was a fundamental question. Should the president have near total control over trade decisions, or must Congress set clear and enforceable limits to prevent overreach? This case quickly became a pivotal test of constitutional boundaries, raising important questions about the future of U.S. trade law and the separation of powers between the branches of government. Ultimately, the Supreme Court's decision would not only impact steel tariffs, but also redefine the balance of power in American economic policy for years to come. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, ruled that Section 232's vague definition of national security gave the president too much unchecked power. The majority said Congress must provide clear guidelines, not a blank check for executive action on trade. The court distinguished between military matters, where deference is due, and economic policy, which requires legislative oversight. The ruling criticized the indiscriminate application of tariffs to allies, calling it economic protectionism, not true security policy. Dissenting justices warned the decision could limit future presidents' flexibility and argued that national security is inherently broad. The majority insisted that only Congress can authorize such sweeping trade measures. The decision sets a new standard for how far presidential authority can go in trade policy. With the tariffs struck down, U.S. Customs must stop collecting duties on steel and aluminum imports, offering immediate relief to importers. Companies may seek refunds for billions paid since 2018, creating administrative challenges for the government. Tariff rate quota agreements with allies are now void, forcing new negotiations and a likely return to pre-2018 trade terms. Domestic steel and aluminum producers face renewed foreign competition and may lobby Congress for new protections. The decision triggers a political battle over the future of U.S. industrial policy. Retaliatory tariffs from the EU and China are expected to be lifted, helping American exporters recover. The ruling begins a slow de-escalation of global trade tensions. The U.S. and its partners must now rebuild a stable, rules-based trading system. The Supreme Court's decision marks a shift in trade policy-making power from the president back to Congress. For decades, Congress ceded authority to the executive, but this ruling sets new constitutional limits. Lawmakers may now push to clarify and tighten trade laws, requiring more oversight and specific definitions of national security. The executive will need to justify trade actions to Congress and the public, making policy more transparent but potentially slower. The president may turn to multilateral institutions and traditional negotiations, moving away from unilateral tariffs. The era of using national security as a catch-all for protectionism is likely over. However, protectionist sentiment remains strong, and Congress can still pass new trade barriers. The debate over free trade versus protectionism will now play out in Congress, not the courts. The ruling changes the rules of engagement, not the underlying political battles. America's approach to global commerce is entering a new, more deliberative phase. U.S. allies in Europe and North America welcomed the ruling, seeing it as a return to predictable, rules-based trade. The decision removes a major irritant, allowing for renewed cooperation on shared economic and security challenges. The EU and others are moving to lift retaliatory tariffs, benefiting American exporters and restoring trust. In China, the response is cautious. The ruling doesn't affect separate tariffs on Chinese goods, but Beijing is watching for broader changes. The World Trade Organization sees the decision as a boost for multilateralism and the global trading system. The US is signaling a shift from unilateralism to international cooperation. The hope is for a new era of partnership, higher standards, and stability in global trade. The Supreme Court's decision may revive stalled WTO reforms and strengthen global trade law. The Supreme Court's ruling ends a contentious era of unilateral tariffs and executive-driven trade policy. It restores congressional authority, setting the stage for a new era of legislative debate and diplomacy. The immediate effects, ending tariffs, lifting retaliatory duties, and reopening negotiations, will reshape global commerce. American businesses face new opportunities and uncertainties as the rules change. Allies welcome the chance to rebuild trust and cooperation. The decision forces the U.S. to rethink its economic strategy and global role. The core debate, protectionism versus free trade, remains unresolved, but the process will now be more transparent and democratic. America's next chapter in global commerce will be defined by Congress, diplomacy, and the choices made in a rapidly changing world.